Welcome to our coverage of Chapter 19, our final chapter this semester in Money and Financial Intermediation. And we're going to talk today about the conduct of monetary policy, both strategy and tactics. And this chapter is really going to examine the primary goals of monetary policy and look in some detail of one of the most important strategies, inflation targeting. We're going to look at the importance of a nominal anchor, which is actually going to be the inflation rate and inflation targeting. We'll talk about the 6 goals of monetary policymakers, distinctions between hierarchical and dual mandates, some of the advantages and disadvantages of inflation targeting, some of the changes that the Fed has made in their monetary policy strategy. We're also going to list some of the lessons learned from the global financial crisis, summarize some of the arguments for and against central bank policy, response to asset price bubbles. Particularly, this has become more of an interest after the financial crisis of 2008. We'll look at 4 criteria for choosing a policy instrument. And finally, we're going to interpret and assess the performance of the Taylor Rule as a hypothetical policy instrument for setting the Fed funds rate. Now, price stability has been a primary goal of central banks around the world. And really in the last 20, 30 years, policymakers have become more and more aware that inflation, controlling inflation, should be their number one priority. Because as a country potentially faces high inflation, that really eats away at the buying power of their currency and hurts the general public fairly seriously, particularly those on fixed incomes. So the goal of trying to keep prices relatively stable and inflation under control has emerged as kind of the top goal of policymakers around the world. Now, in pursuing that goal, the role of a nominal anchor, such as the inflation rate or potentially the money supply, has been recognized as a way to help in achieving the goal of price stability. Now, in addition to price stability, we've talked about the fact that there are other goals that central banks usually have as objectives for their monetary policy. And we've got 5 here that should be pretty familiar, that they want to see high employment and output stability, or conversely low unemployment, economic growth, stability of financial markets, also stability in the level of interest rates, and finally stability in the currency and foreign exchange markets. Question often arises, and it's an interesting question here in the United States, about should price stability be the primary goal of monetary policy? And when we talk about that primary goal, we can compare and contrast the hierarchical mandate versus the dual mandate. The hierarchical would put the goal of price stability clearly first. That would be identified as the primary goal, and then as long as it is achieved, other goals can be pursued. So you'd say price stability is number one, then certainly we'd like to see strong employment and stable interest rates and the other goals we had mentioned, but clearly put price stability first. Now that contrasts with what we have in the U.S. as a dual mandate, where the Fed is looking to achieve two equal objectives of price stability and maximum employment, along with output stability. So the U.S. kind of has this dual mandate of watching both price stability and keeping inflation under control, as well as trying to keep maximum employment levels. And the U.S. is kind of the one major country that has the dual mandate. Some of the others, as you can see, the European Central Bank, UK, Canada, are based more on a hierarchical model. But it's pointed out, either way, either is acceptable as long as it operates to make price stability as the primary long-run goal. And that's an interesting point about the United States, that even though you've got a dual mandate, and at times, and we're probably in a time right now where you could argue we're facing a difficult situation with the pandemic, and the Fed is taking actions to try and increase employment and spur on the economy, and they've lowered interest rates as far as they can, at least the target for the Fed funds rate. They still have an eye on inflation, and long run, they don't want to do things that potentially leads to high levels of inflation for years to come. So they have to kind of keep an eye on, as they do things in the short run to try and help to get the economy back on track, they still want to make sure that they're keeping an eye towards the future and the long run goal of price stability. Now, we're going to get into a discussion of inflation targeting as a way of trying to reach your long-term goal of price stability. Now, when we talk about inflation targeting, the first point of that, and clearly when you say targeting, it involves a public announcement of generally a medium term, around 3-year numerical target for inflation. So it involves the central bank coming out and clearly announcing that they have a target for inflation of, and they're going to give a specific number. So that's the underlying premise of inflation targeting. And it's usually, say, around a medium term, around 3 years. Here's where we'd like to be in terms of an intermediate term goal of a level of inflation. So it involves really this institutional commitment for price stability as the primary long-term goal or long-run goal of monetary policy. And in the U.S. and really other central banks around the world, to reach that goal, it usually involves gathering a lot of information, looking at many variables, and gathering information about prices, current prices, leading indicators of where prices may be headed, as much economic information as can be gathered to try and make the decision to undertake monetary policy to help reach the level that they'd like to be at long term. Now, one of the advantages of going to a clear public announcement is increased transparency compared to just saying we want to have low inflation. Well, if you can be more specific about what you really need, it's easier to then see exactly what the plans of the central bank are. And historically, the United States didn't have, or prior to 2012, didn't use inflation targeting and just said in general, we'd like to see stable prices, but they were kind of hazy as to exactly what that meant. So by identifying a specific target amount, target level of inflation, you become more transparent and also more accountable. That now you can come back and go to the central bank and say, you said your goal was 2%, well, you're at 3%, or you're at 1%, what happened? And the central bank is going to be more accountable to say, well, they've got to explain what did occur and answer to the public, Congress, and so on. When we talk about inflation targeting, we can look at a few countries that started down that road in the early 90s. New Zealand, Canada, the UK, all came out and officially adopted inflation targeting in 90, 91, 92. And in the time after they started utilizing and announcing a definitive inflation target, they actually saw good results. Inflation was brought down and was relatively stable in all of these countries, and also unemployment came down and good things happened. So there was some evidence that inflation targeting was reasonably successful in these countries. And here's a graph showing kind of before they went to inflation targeting and after, and whether you can attribute it all to inflation targeting or not is probably up for some discussion. And some people might say it was other things as well as inflation targeting, but certainly inflation targeting seemed, when you hit that point, seemed to create more stability and lower inflation rates in the countries once they went to inflation targeting. So from that standpoint, there was some good empirical evidence that inflation targeting, in fact, was successful in leading to lower inflation and more stability in the countries that adopted it. And when we talk about general advantages and disadvantages, certainly an advantage of inflation targeting is that it is easily understood. If the central bank comes out and says, hey, our inflation target is 2%, over the next 3 years, that's pretty straightforward, and you don't have to have a degree in economics to figure out what that really means. It also helps to reduce the potential of falling into this time inconsistency trap. This really refers to potentially focusing on short-term issues, and now would be a good example where the economy's in trouble and you're going to do things that are going to spur the economy on, but those might also lead to higher inflation down the road. And if you don't have a target set, it's kind of easy to get caught up in the short-term issues, and in dealing with those, maybe overshoot and lose sight of your long-term goals. We also talked already about transparency and accountability, which are positive things when you come out with a specific target. There are some disadvantages, though. One, delayed signaling, that a lot of times to reach longer term, maybe 3-year intermediate goals of inflation, and the fact that you've got to take action today, and it might take, we've talked about this also, the idea of kind of, for the central bank, the policies that they undertake today may take months or even a year or two to fully see the results of actions taken today. And the fact that you've got an intermediate term goal out there, it just means once you set that goal, it's hard to determine exactly what's going on with some of their policies today, because what they're doing today is really based on expectations well down the road. So you do have this kind of delay of what are they doing, and are they doing this today for reasons a year from now, 3 years from now, or whatever. Another issue is, by setting a specific goal, it can create a problem of being too rigid. And again, you might argue right now, hey, we're in a crisis situation. It's a worldwide pandemic. The central banks should be doing everything they can to get us out of this situation. And let's forget about our goals for inflation. And because this is such a severe issue, we need to do everything we can to get back on track, and let's not worry too much about what's going to be the inflationary impact of these things, because people are in dire need today and need all the help they can get with policies that encourage economic growth and put people back to work and help get the economy back on track. And in fact, actually, one of the things that the Fed has come out with recently is that they've said we're going to have a range. Basically, they did say that their target is not a firm target, but a target over time, and that basically if inflation shoots up a little higher than their 2% target for a period of time, maybe in response to things that they're doing trying to get the economy back on track, they aren't going to be too concerned about that. So they actually came out with something saying that we're not going to be too rigid, and we're not going to be terribly concerned if, in response to all the actions we're taking right now to try and help the economy get back on track and boost employment, that if that ends up shooting inflation up to 2.5%, we'll live with that, and we'll try and get it back to a range of 2% over time, but we aren't going to worry about being so rigid that we limit what we do right now with concerns about inflation somewhere down the road, because things are too serious right now. So that is a potential concern with targeting, that it might be too rigid and limit what you can do in the short term. And that's the third point, potential for increase in output fluctuations, kind of goes along with that idea that you might have, if you're trying to keep inflation under control, as you're very primary goal, you might let the economy get into more difficulty and not do as much to help it out and to spur employment, and basically you might not lower interest rates as much because you are worried about inflation more so than you're worried about short-term employment fluctuations. And that goes along with the last point of low economic growth during disinflation. If you've got periods of disinflation, you may be looking also at low economic growth, potential disadvantage, but as we'll see, I think most would agree that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. Inflation targeting. Now, with the evolution of the Fed's policy, the Fed certainly didn't utilize inflation targeting up until, and didn't come out and officially go to inflation targeting until 2012. So if we go back to like in the 1970s, 1975, the Fed began to announce publicly their targets for money supply growth. And back in the 70s, rather than talking about a Fed funds rate, they focused more on money supply and controlling the money supply. So back in the mid-70s, they started to publicly announce targets for money supply. And by the end of the 70s, Chairman Volcker focused on non-borrowed reserves, which is something that the Fed had a little bit more control over than the money supply growth in general. By 93, Chairman Greenspan changed over and said the Fed would not use monetary aggregates as a guide for controlling and conducting monetary policy. Really switched over at that point. They started focusing more on the Fed funds rate, on interest rates, and Fed funds in particular, rather than monetary aggregates, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in this chapter. Then as I mentioned before, up until 2012, there wasn't an explicit nominal factor or nominal anchor for the Fed, no inflation targeting until then. There were, though, some discussions of kind of a recognition that inflation needed to be dealt with on an ongoing basis. There were some preemptive strikes that they would take, where they would actually, for instance, start raising interest rates, slow down the economy, even though inflation wasn't growing too rapidly at that point in time. There was a feeling that if the economy kept going and growing at the rate that it had been, then there could be inflation in the future. So the Fed would sometimes step in and say, we need to slow down the economy here. We don't have inflation now, but if we don't slow down the economy, we could see inflation in the future. And thus this idea of preemptive strikes. So that third point points out the goal was kind of prevent inflation from really getting started and getting out of control. Now, when we look back at their policies, advantages, they did use many sources of information, and they were generally pretty successful, that they kept inflation under control by and large. and that the economy grew at a pretty solid rate, and unemployment stayed relatively low. Disadvantages, again, a lack of accountability and transparency. They never really said exactly what they wanted. They just wanted relatively stable prices, relatively low inflation, but they didn't ever quantify exactly what that meant. And therefore, nobody could come back and say, well, you didn't exactly reach your goals, because they never really specifically identified goals. They had just kind of general, hazy goals, which were difficult to determine whether they exactly reached them or not. So this lack of accountability and transparency also is kind of inconsistent with democratic principles, where if you can't really hold the people accountable very well, it's tough for particularly like elected officials that are working with the Fed, and the Congress created the Fed, and the Fed chairman meets and does presentations in front of Congress periodically, and Congress certainly does have to answer to the people, and if something's not quite right, or if they feel that the unemployment's a little higher than they'd like it, certainly the politicians come under fire. But when the Fed comes in, they can kind of say, well, we met our general goals, and we tried to, when you look at it, the economy's okay and inflation's relatively low, but it's all kind of hazy. And again, if it's hard to hold them accountable and things aren't very transparent, then and they don't really have to answer clearly to the general public, it's, some would argue, not very democratic in terms of when you look at the rest of our high elected officials. It seems like the Fed is a little out of step with that, and certainly some could argue that it's not a democratic way of operating. So sometimes this policy of the Feds was just referred to as "just do it," where they employed kind of a forward-looking approach, tried to see where they saw prices going in the future. This helped to discourage overly expansionary monetary policy, and tried to keep things, when things were going well in the economy, they often kind of slowed things down to keep inflation from getting out of control. And that would be seen as basically an advantage of the approach. Disadvantage, as we've talked about, lack of transparency. And a lot of it depended on, and if we go back to a lot of the just do it occurred under Greenspan, a strong dependence on the skills of the leaders at that point, the governors and Greenspan in particular, that you were kind of, he was, because it wasn't very democratic, you were dependent on him doing a good job. And basically the board of governors, the people of the folks that were involved in the open market committee, that you had to be comfortable that they had the skills and the trustworthiness to be taking the right actions that were going to benefit the country as a whole. And that they weren't, for instance, doing things to line their own pockets or their their cronies in Wall Street or something else. So that kind of veil of secrecy to a degree of what they were doing, and some of the lack of clarity and transparency. I mean, as long as things were going well, it was okay. And if things hadn't gone as smoothly in terms of low inflation and low unemployment, I'm sure there would have been a lot more questions asked about what are they really doing. But overall, it was relatively successful. Now, the interesting part, and one of the things you should recognize that's brought out in this Inside the Fed piece of talking about Ben Bernanke, who was ultimately the chairman of the Fed for a period of time. He was pretty good friends with Mishkin, the author of the book. And one of the reasons why I think there's quite a bit of discussion on inflation targeting was Mishkin himself, the book's author, along with Bernanke, were in favor of going towards inflation targeting. So, as is pointed out, while Bernanke was a professor at Princeton, he wrote some articles and a book, and he co-authored those with Mishkin, and argued that inflation targeting would be a major step forward for the Fed and would produce better outcomes. And when Bernanke took his position as governor of the Fed from 2002 to 2005, he continued to be a strong advocate for going to inflation targeting, and ultimately the Fed moved to inflation targeting January of 2012, about going on almost, well, over 8 years ago. And they set a target of 2% for inflation, and it has basically been at that level since. Or the target has been at least in that level since. Actually, they've often been a little bit below. Inflation has actually been below the target a little bit. And just for an interesting point of that 2% number, they choose 2%, and some will say, well, hey, why not just zero and keep prices totally stable? Well, the problem with going and having a target of zero is the potential of disinflation and actually having prices falling, and that is a problematic situation that generally you want to avoid that. So most countries will set the target low, but a little bit away from zero, so that prices can be positive, moving up a little, but staying well under control. And 2% is a pretty common target level for most countries to set for their goal of intermediate term inflation. Now, they also point out that the European Central Bank has slowly moved towards inflation targeting and has a strategy now that includes certainly some elements of inflation targeting. Okay, so we're going to take a step away from inflation targeting now and talk a little bit about monetary policy in general and some things that we learned from the global financial crisis in 2008. because that certainly made the world step back and say, okay, what happened here, and how could the central banks potentially have helped to avoid the mess that occurred, and what can we do in the future to try and ensure that something like that doesn't happen again? So, some big takeaways. First of all, a clear thing that came out was that the financial sector and developments in the financial sector can have far greater impact on economic activity than was earlier realized. And that I think initially there was a feeling like, well, the banks have gotten into trouble, and it's the banks and Wall Street, and there was a general perception, I think, initially that, well, let's just let them work this out. And some of those guys are greedy rascals anyways, and maybe we're just as happy that it caught up with them and that they're finally having to pay for some of the risk that they took and for the way they lined their pockets over recent years. And if they struggle, well, they took the risk, and they should just be left to deal with it. The problem was that the problems in the financial sector quickly became problems throughout the economy and had wide-ranging implications and worldwide impact. And unfortunately, a major bailout was required, and so I think one of the lessons was clearly learned that when you have major issues in the financial sector, it is turns quickly into a across the entire economy problem, and with the major international players involved, a worldwide problem. Second point that we found was of the zero lower bound problem. And the zero lower bound on interest rates can be a serious issue, that once you get that Fed funds target rate down to zero, you're kind of stuck, and you can't go any further. And if that isn't enough to get the economy back moving in a positive direction, then you've got to go to some other types of non-conventional types of policies. And it certainly can be a problem, and one of the reasons why there's probably a little concern now that we're back at zero and we can't lower our Fed funds target rate any further, and are going to potentially have to go back to some more of the non-conventional, maybe buying longer term assets and other things to try and spur the economy on. Third point, that certainly the cost of cleanup after the financial crisis can be very high. It was, well, a lot of individuals suffered. You had, as a result of some of it with the housing crisis, with the fall in the stock market, with the fall of mortgage-backed securities, many investors took serious hits. Individuals in their home, other individuals lost their homes. You had a significant drop in employment and had high unemployment for 5 or 6 years following the initial drop in the markets and the beginning of the crisis. So it was a very costly crisis that occurred, with a lot of individuals around the world being deeply impacted. And a fourth point that's kind of interesting, that leading up to the collapse in 2008, you had price and output being very stable, that inflation was under control and employment was high and stable, and really everything looked very good. And some would argue that was part of the reason that the ultimate crisis was as bad as it was, is because nobody really saw it coming. That there weren't signs out there saying, oh my goodness, or well, what signs there were, very few people really recognized. But inflation was under control, and you'd say most of the things the Fed would be worried about looked good. Inflation was low, employment was high, the general measures of stability looked good, but it certainly didn't ensure financial stability, as things quickly deteriorated once things started to fall apart in the subprime market and mortgage-backed securities dropped significantly in value. So coming out of that, one of the questions is, okay, if we see something along these lines in the future, these asset price bubbles, and in the case of 2008, the big asset bubble that was occurring was in the U.S. housing market, that housing prices were raising significantly around the country, and particularly in the hot markets where you were seeing in the Sun Belt housing prices going up 10-15% a year or more in some markets. That's kind of this idea of an asset bubble, is this pronounced increase in prices, which unfortunately usually eventually burst, and the asset prices get down to a more normal level. Now, when we talk about these asset price bubbles, there's a couple of different factors that may help to create them. One is a credit-driven bubble, where easy to get credit allows buyers to purchase more assets. If we think about the housing market, that was subprime lending that allowed more people to get access to mortgages than had ever been the case prior to that. It led to a rapid increase in the housing prices that helped to inflate the bubble, if you will. And this can happen in other markets as well. Sometimes it's access to business loans that can allow businesses certain aspects to grow to a level that they historically hadn't been able to reach. But certainly in the global crisis, it was mortgage credit that helped to lead to the increase in housing prices. Now, sometimes there's bubbles that are driven more by irrational exuberance. A lot of times this has happened in the stock market, where you've had, and this, an example of the irrational exuberance would have been during the late 90s into the turn of the century, 2000, where you had what was called the dot-com bubble, where the internet was just coming into play, and there was a number of internet companies that grew up during this time, and there was irrational excitement in the stock market that anything that had to do with the internet and had a .com or something where they had a significant exposure on the internet, the feeling was that was just the wave of the future, and that it was a new paradigm, that all of these companies were bound for greatness, and stock prices, and particularly companies that had any exposure, and basically all types of companies then said they had exposure. Some did and some didn't. But they were all saying, oh yes, we're going to take advantage of this new internet, and we're going to be tripling our sales or whatever. People bought into this. The stock market went crazy, and unfortunately, by 2001 into 2002, it became clear that not all of these companies were going to be gangbusters, and a number of the companies that had been around for 3 or 4 years were still losing money on a significant basis. Thus, you had the stock market bubble burst, and the country went into a relatively short recession following the stock market crash of 2001. So, some of the points is economists have looked at past bubbles and tried to determine, well, what should the Fed really be doing? What should central banks do in cases where they see maybe bubbles forming and asset prices growing at an unsustainable rate? Well, one of the things they've come up with is that there's a relatively strong argument for not responding to bubbles driven by irrational exuberance, that they're not as dangerous generally and are not as widespread a problem, and that often you can just kind of let those run their course. And if we go back to the example of the stock market crash in 2001, it hurt certainly the players that were involved in that, and was a bit of a jolt to the economy, and there was a short recession immediately following that, but quickly the economy got back on track, and the problem wasn't that widespread, and thus the feeling is if it looks like there's not any credit involved with that, and lenders are not helping to boost the level of involvement and the size of the bubble, then if it's just irrational exuberance, it's not something to be as concerned about. Second point is that bubbles are often easier to identify when both asset prices and credit are increasing rapidly at the same time. And that, again, should have been more widely recognized going into 2008, when you had housing prices going up very rapidly, and the fact that a lot of it was being driven by subprime lending, that those mortgage loans were made with continually lowering standards, and that looking at it, credit was increasing rapidly. That was certainly helping to boost those asset prices and creating a much larger problem. Kind of a third point is that to come out, monetary policy should probably lean against credit booms, as credit-driven bubbles tend to be more dangerous bubbles. So looking at it, probably in hindsight, the Fed should have been looking at subprime lending and saying, it's probably going too far, and that its standards had been lowered to too low a level and that, and again, in hindsight, if things had slowed down in terms of the availability of credit, the problem wouldn't have been as bad as it ended up being. So in responding to those bubbles, what should the Fed have done? Well, one is look at policy that is non-monetary but macro-prudential, where they probably should have been looking at regulation and regulatory policy that would affect what's happening in the credit markets. And certainly what they did in hindsight, and we know by looking at Dodd-Frank, that was the Dodd-Frank Act that was passed by Congress in the aftermath of the financial crisis. They tightened up the rules and regulations regarding mortgage loans and made it more difficult to get mortgage loans and held the lenders to higher standards. And so there was a number of things done to try and deal with the problems in the subprime market that had occurred. But unfortunately, it was after the problem had already occurred. In retrospect, it would have been much better if some of those regulatory policies had been put into place in 2002, 2003, 2004, leading up to the problem and helping to limit the size of the problem. But unfortunately, it's always easier to see those things in hindsight than when they are occurring. And as I've mentioned before, there was a lot of excitement during 2003, 2004, 2005 because the economy was going so well and so many people were getting into houses, and we had first-time home buyers entering the market, and the construction industry was going great guns, and there was a lot of good things occurring because of the easy credit that was available. The problem is that eventually when a bubble is created like that, it's not sustainable, and then you end up with potentially a major crisis somewhere down the road. Monetary policy is more of the setting, for instance, in our case, Fed funds targets. And there, again, coming away from what we saw out of the 2008 crisis, is the central banks, other regulators should not have a laissez-faire attitude and let credit-driven bubbles proceed without any reaction. Because that's largely what happened. Was the central bank was saying, well, we're going to stay out of this. Things are going well. There's a lot of folks that are happy about basically this easier credit that's available, and we think they stayed on the sideline and didn't interfere, where now in hindsight, again, a lesson learned out of that is that they probably should not have had that laissez-faire attitude, but should have stepped in and taken action to maybe raise interest rates a bit, slow things down, make it a little less attractive for borrowers, so that again, the housing boom that was underway would be dampened a bit, and you wouldn't see the type of housing prices increase that again were those runaway housing prices were not on a sustainable track, and eventually there were going to be problems. Now we're going to talk a little bit about policy tools, policy instruments, and this is, you're going to see, we've already talked about the fact that the Fed, and for a number of years, has been using the Fed funds target as an interest rates and the Fed fund rate in particular as their primary policy tool. But we're going to spend, and the next couple of slides are going to talk about the choice of those tools and how did we really end up getting to the point where the Fed funds rate is the primary tool of the central bank. So when we talk about those tools, and again, in the last chapter, we talked about the fact that really the Fed has kind of moved away from open market operations per se. I've added target range for the Fed funds rate. Now that again, in chapter 19, they're talking about open market operations. We can recognize that really what they're focusing on is the idea that the primary thing that they come out with and use as their policy tool is this target rate in Fed funds. So when it says open market operations, you can again just be thinking, okay, that's the Fed's decision to use the Fed funds rate as their primary tool for monetary policy, for trying to spur the economy on or slow it down. Another tool is reserve requirements, and that's another thing that we've talked about. They've actually moved reserve requirements down to zero. So reserve requirements is not really a significant tool for them currently. The discount rate is part of what they do with their open market operations, and that kind of sets the ceiling for the Fed funds target rate. When you talk about policy instruments or the operating instrument, you can look at either reserve aggregates, which is really talking more about money supply or the amount of non-borrowed reserves. So it's measuring reserves and money that's out available for the economy. So that's one thing you can be focused on. Or another is interest rates, which is more where they have been. And either of these may be linked to kind of an intermediate target, saying that, well, we're right here right now, but we might want to be at a level somewhere a year or two down the road. The third point is that interest rates and aggregate targets are incompatible. Basically, you got to choose one or the other. You can't be using both and say, well, we got a target for money supply and a target for interest rates. No, it's either going to be an aggregate target of money supply or the total amount of non-borrowed reserves, or it's going to be interest rates. And the next couple of slides will kind of demonstrate that. But this figure 2 shows linkages between tools of the central bank, their basic policy instruments, whether they're going to go with aggregates or interest rates. And we've talked about, in the first group, tools quite a bit already. Policy instruments being aggregates or interest rates. The intermediate targets for monetary aggregates might be M1 or M2, kind of the amount of measures of the money supply. Interest rates could be short-term or long-term. And the short-term is the one they really control, but they might, and we know actually some of what they did with large-scale asset purchases and forward guidance, they're also trying to impact the long-term rates as well as the short-term rates. And their goals clearly price stability, high employment, economic growth. But we're going to focus on those policy instruments. Why have they really gone with interest rates rather than aggregates? And if we go back to the idea of how the Fed funds rate really gets set, we can see here, step one, a shift in the demand curve for reserves is going to lead to a fluctuation in the Fed funds rate. And the supply of reserves is really those non-borrowed reserves that the Fed can control, and that is a primary aggregate measure. So you've got that non-borrowed reserves being an aggregate that impacts the short-term interest rates. And that's why we say if we, for instance, have a target of non-borrowed reserves of a certain number, if we keep that right where it is, then if something happens to the demand for reserves, there's going to be a fluctuation in the interest rate. And thus, setting reserves, non-borrowed reserves at a certain level and having a target level for reserves is kind of meaning that you're going to be in a position that interest rates are going to fluctuate as you're trying to keep your aggregate stable. And that's comes back to that point of why you got to choose one or the other, because stable, in this case, the stable aggregate of non-borrowed reserves means that potentially interest rates are going to fluctuate in the short term if you can't move that non-borrowed reserves around. And there's some changes in demand for reserves, which can happen from time to time. You're going to see interest rates fluctuate. Now, in this case, if we've got a specific target rate for Fed funds, step one, a rightward or leftward shift in the demand curve leads to step two, central bank shifting the supply curve, and that's really moving the non-borrowed reserves around, and that's in essence what had been happening in recent years with monetary policy, that the Fed would buy and sell treasuries and increase or decrease the amount of non-borrowed reserves out there. So in essence, that's what the Fed was doing on a daily basis to keep the Fed funds target rate at a certain level. So what this is just demonstrating is that if you want to keep interest rates at a certain level, you're going to have to move potentially non-borrowed reserves around. And the previous slide kind of said if you want to keep non-borrowed reserves at a certain level, it's going to mean that interest rates are going to fluctuate. So it's these two slides are just helping to demonstrate that you can't have both. You can't have a target aggregate level and a target interest rate. You've got to choose one or the other. So, the question is, which do we choose? What's the best criteria for choosing the policy instrument? Well, there's four major criteria. The first two are observability and measurability. And you want to have things that you can easily observe and measure. And those 2 points go very well with the Fed funds rate. You can observe it. It's basically fluctuates on a daily basis, but it's easy to observe and measure. On the other hand, if you start talking about like M1 and M2, often to gather all the data to identify exactly what is the level of M1, the total money supply. That can take a week or two to gather the data and get it all together. It's not something you can easily determine exactly what is the current level of M1 in the United States. Well, it's going to take a little bit of work to get all the data in to identify about what we're talking there. So it's a little tougher to observe and measure than that Fed funds interest rate. Also, second point, controllability. How well can the Fed control it? Well, we know the Fed has pretty good control over that Fed funds rate. And what they do now with using interest on reserves and the discount rate that they offer to lend out to banks, they control and the reverse repurchase agreement, overnight reverse repurchase agreement for non-banks, they can pretty well determine right about where that Fed funds rate is going to be and set the range very, very closely. Right now, it's between 0 and 0.25%, and they can control it pretty well in that range using the tools they've got. On the other hand, when you talk about trying to control a monetary aggregate and trying to control M1, one of the things we saw with the monetary situation and the money multiplier is you've got different players involved, and one of them is the general public can make decisions as to how much they want in currency versus what they keep at the bank, and that impacts the money multiplier. And so there's more moving pieces there, and it's a little harder for the Fed to precisely control basically what the banks are doing and what the public is doing that can impact the money supply and the amount that's out there. So controllability is also stronger when you talk about the interest rate and using the Fed funds rate as a tool rather than money supply. And finally, predictability effects on goals. Does lowering interest rates help to really slow down the economy, keep inflation under control? And does it do it better than increasing or decreasing the money supply? Well, I think the general consensus is from the major central banks around the world that yes, interest rates is really more predictable in its effects as well. So overall, targeting short-term interest rates has proven to be the policy instrument of choice for the Fed and really for most of the other central banks around the world have gone to looking at setting targets for that interest rate that they can have an impact on as the way that they implement their monetary policy. Now, the decision as to exactly what the target rate should be is always an interesting question that economists have looked at over the years, and one well-known economist at Stanford University, John Taylor, came up with a rule or this equation utilizing inflation and output data that can be used as a guide for setting the Fed funds target rate. So we've said, yes, that Fed funds target rate's really the best tool we've got. Now the question becomes, well, how should we set that rate? And what Taylor did was look at a bunch of historical data and try and determine, okay, looking at what they've done and some of the economics of the relationship between economic growth and inflation and the idea of sustainable output, and some other general economic theory guidelines, he came up with this equation, and we'll look at that next. So his equation says Fed funds target rate should equal current inflation rate plus an equilibrium real Fed funds rate. Typically, they've used around 2% there as a general feeling for an equilibrium Fed funds rate, plus 1/2 an inflation gap, plus 1/2 an output gap. And this, we define the inflation gap as the current level of inflation, current inflation minus the target rate, which in our case would be about 2%. So we'd look and see, is the current inflation rate above or below target? If it's above target, then that inflation gap is going to be positive. If it's below target, the inflation gap will actually be negative. And so it'd be 1/2 times whatever that gap is. If it's negative, then it ends up being subtracted off, and your Fed funds target rate is going to be a little lower. If the inflation gap is positive, it'd be 1/2 times that inflation gap. It's going to mean your Fed funds target rate is going to be a little higher. Likewise, there's an output gap where you're going to look at the real GDP minus this estimated natural GDP level and see, is it above or below? Is our output in terms of measured by GDP above or below kind of what we've identified as a natural sustainable rate for GDP? And again, if the economy is stronger than normal, you'd see a positive output gap. If the economy is weaker than normal, it's going to be a negative and mean that we're going to be looking at a lower Fed funds target rate. And if we talk about right now, when we've got that Fed funds target rate at 0, the reason it's that low is because we've got low inflation, and it's below the target rate, and our real GDP is far below its natural rate, and so we're looking at some serious negatives there, lowering our Fed funds target rate. And also we're talking the current inflation rate is quite low as well. So all of that creates a situation where even according to the current Taylor rule, our Fed funds rate, it's not surprising that it's down close to 0. Now here in figure 5, we're looking at the actual Fed funds rate over the last 60 years relative to what the Taylor rule, if we implemented the Taylor rule back in those times and plugged in the real inflation rate and the output rate at a given time and utilized that equation, what the Taylor rule suggested that the Fed funds rate should be, and you see it's reasonably closely aligned. So it's not a bad method, and it isn't too far off from what policymakers actually set. Now, a final point would be, should we just go to something like the Taylor rule? And rather than having an open market committee meeting, couldn't we just take all the data, put it into a computer, have an equation, something like the Taylor rule, and let that pop out what the target rate should be and take all the guesswork out of it? Well, I think most would agree that putting the monetary policy into the hands of just a simple equation kind of an autopilot idea is problematic. That the Taylor rule has some value as a guide to monetary policy, and to say, well, according to what the Taylor rule would say, here's where we should be, but do we want to be above or below that? Well, like in today's situation, it's a unique pandemic problem that we haven't seen anything like this for 100 years. So should we be relying on an equation that was put together looking at historical data over the last 50, 60 years and relationships that worked at that time? The argument would be, hey, this is a unique situation, and relying on something that was put together based on past relationships might not be the best thing, and that there are critical, and the argument would be today, there may be some critical issues that go beyond normal times where you might be more comfortable relying on just a basic equation, because we're into a situation that is unlike what we've seen in the past. And therefore, relying on something and a relatively simple equation doesn't take into account all the complex issues that affect a world economy and affect, in the case currently of a lot of people's lives being impacted by a pandemic, puts things into a different realm, different perspective, and you want to have the flexibility to deal with these unique situations that may occur from time to time. So that would be kind of the general argument that, yeah, it's a useful guide, but you wouldn't want to turn it all over to just some type of computer model or equation that's been put together by a top economist or a group of economists. All right, final point is kind of wrapping up the overall discussion of policies and a final inside the Fed piece, looking at the fact that the Fed plays such an important role in the direction of our economy and through monetary policies and regulatory changes and so forth, and the fact that they kind of control a key interest rate that has impact on interest rates in general. You've got investors and financial institutions that are continually watching to see what the Fed is doing and what their next move might be. And these folks are often referred to as Fed watchers. And often financial institutions, it's one of the things, if you want to be an economist and you get to work in the Federal Reserve, often you can find a job after you've worked in the Federal Reserve, working for a firm in the private sector who just wants your input as to what do you think they're thinking. You worked for the Fed, what do you think the Fed is going to do next? And so these Fed watchers get hired as experts on Federal Reserve behavior, and they are relied upon by often banks, Wall Street firms, investment firms, basically anybody who's concerned about interest rates and where interest rates might be headed. And often you can make a pretty good living as just being an inside expert on the activities of the Federal Reserve. So after you've worked for a number of years at the Fed, you can go out, often find a position in the private sector where you just continue to follow the Fed closely. And the fact that you were on the inside for a number of years, you've got a certain level of knowledge and understanding that those who haven't worked for the Fed don't have. And so you can often parlay that into a nice position. So it's kind of interesting. Unfortunately, just taking this class probably doesn't give you the kind of knowledge base that is going to get you a top level position, and you got to actually work for the Fed. But hopefully you've gotten a reasonable amount out of this class that, and as I feel like understanding the banking system, the Federal Reserve, can serve you well wherever you end up, because the Federal Reserve does have a big impact on the economy, on interest rates, on things that are always going to be of a fairly significant importance to the business world. So hopefully you got a reasonable amount out of this class with regards to that. Certainly, hopefully a better understanding, at least how the Fed, what it is, how it operates. So that said, that's the end of my lectures. Good luck on your final exam. Certainly, if you've got questions, you can email me. And as I say, best of luck on the exam and in your futures. And take care and enjoy the holidays.